I'm Natalie Alexander. Welcome to AI and Multilateralism, a playlist of conversations here at the Commons, our space at the UN Library and Archives, Geneva, for sharing knowledge on multilateralism. In this series, we're joined by experts who help us unpack the many ideas and issues at the nexus of AI and international cooperation. Today's guests are bringing a bold idea, that public AI is the new multilateralism, where shared AI infrastructure equips us collectively to solve problems and find solutions to the challenges facing our world. Jacob Taylor is a fellow at the Brookings Institution's Center for Sustainable Development and a 2025 Public AI Fellow. Joshua Tan is co-founder and research director at Metagov. So how do we make public AI happen? Let's hear their views. Jacob Taylor and Joshua Tan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here, Natalie.
Thanks for having us.
It's great to have you with us. I want to, before we dive into your collective research and work together on a very interesting aspect of AI and multilateralism, to firstly hear from both of you your thoughts on what's driving your research. Maybe firstly to you, Jacob, through your work at the Brookings Institution and your other work as a public AI fellow, what are the big themes you believe are most important for us to talk about and address when we think about the impact of AI globally?
Thanks, Natalie. And I come at this as an anthropologist by training and kind of ended up at a policy think tank as a result of pursuing some of those ideas and how to make them practical. So my big focus is really on what are the mechanisms of collective intelligence that can allow groups or communities of all scales to have ability to solve problems together, and particularly problems that are hard to solve in one-off approaches. So we work here at Brookings on really this broad problem area of sustainable development, which has this kind of triple helix of environmental, social, and economic challenges that all kind of interact at all scales. And so the question is, like, what are the new approaches and infrastructures that can actually help people advance these issues? And it's in that context that AI and digital infrastructure and technology become super relevant across all types of shared challenges, from tackling climate-related issues to social equity and exclusion issues like poverty or gender equality and so on. So that's kind of where my thoughts on AI really come together. But on a personal background, my research as an anthropologist is all around elite team performance and how small groups really perform at their best. And so I bring a lot of intuitions from that, from other lives in professional sport and elite team dynamics when I think about some of these things. So in a way, multilateralism for me is just how do you get the team together on global problems? Josh, maybe over to you.
Josh, yes, coming from your background at Metagov and other projects, what do you see as the big themes and issues that we really need to collectively talk about?
Yeah, certainly within AI, a lot of the themes of public AI really revolve around market power, around political legitimacy, around, what is in some sense, these systems, these large AI systems, LLMs, were trained on thousands of years of civilization, part of our public endowment, but effectively being walled off and exploited by a few very large companies, headquarters typically in Silicon Valley or in Shenzhen, right? I think there's a huge missed opportunity there and a challenge for, in this case, many middle power countries, though to be clear, it's a challenge faced by some of the global superpowers as well, around who stands to benefit and how can we address those. So I come at it very much from that perspective. My background's both in theoretical machine learning. I also have a background in institutional economics. How do we build institutions, both at the small scale, but also at the large scales that are fit for purpose?
So bringing kind of these two backgrounds and interests together, the common theme connecting you both is this idea of public AI. You're a public AI fellow, Jacob, and public AI is an initiative also run through Metagov. Can you walk us through what does this mean? What exactly is public AI? Do you want to start, Josh?
That's definitely a question for Josh, but yeah.
I think public AI is very much a movement of many, many people Jacob is absolutely a leader in that, but it is also kind of by design, not a specific entity per se. But let me pull back. What is public AI? Public AI is, first off, an idea. This is the idea that AI can and should be a form of public infrastructure. Think highways or parks or water or electricity or even the internet, and not something that should be owned and controlled by, a few giant tech companies. In practice, this can mean lots of different things in different countries. So I gave all these different examples of public infrastructure. So parks and highways, for example, are entirely built and funded by governments, or often are, right? Whereas water and electricity, these are often provisioned by private companies, but operating as public utilities. We're regulated as public utilities, with often like a profit cap. And the internet, it's, depending on your country, it's almost all private infrastructure, but it is operated and controlled and managed through public protocols, governed through multi-stakeholder systems like the IGF and others, ICANN, IETF. And these, because of that, we kind of regard them as a form of public infrastructure. So in different countries or different layers of the stack, public AI can look different. So there's many, many different examples, I would say. If you want to pull up realistic, like actual real examples, you could take a look at Apertus in Switzerland. You can look at Empire AI in New York State. You can look at a lot of what the Barcelona Supercomputing Center is doing, or the larger sort of UAHPC framework, all the public compute that is accessible across the continent in specific countries. You can look at AI Singapore, providing public services, including AI. You can look at Ukraine with some amazing public services, often sort of with AI embedded through their digital platform. There are many, many different examples of public AI that are emerging across the world. I think in a way that would surprise a lot of the people that are kind of thinking about AI, because it's not something that's like, it's hard to break through sometimes between the wall-to-wall coverage of the private labs.
So from what I understand, we do have public AI initiatives, projects popping up around the world. But our reality today is that most AI development and deployment is not public infrastructure, is not shared infrastructure. I want to look now at a very interesting article you co-wrote together, where you argue that public AI is the new multilateralism, that traditional rules-based, treaty-centric models of multilateralism is stuck. I'm wondering here, do you see the trajectory of AI development today kind of exposing why multilateralism is stuck? Jacob.
That's a good question. Yeah, so I think to paraphrase Josh's explanation of public AI, in a way it's trying to give people a kind of vegan or organic alternative to these big private walled off infrastructures that no one can really shape or has equity in. And that includes like all the way up and down the stack of technologies, the compute, the data infrastructure, the interaction interface with the model and so on. Countries are interested and are going off on their own to build their own versions that are more public facing and public in spirit. But the big issue here is the performance gap. There's just such a gap between the two horses at the front of the pack, which is China and the US and their frontier labs and the rest of the world. So going it alone to build an alternative is not really viable given how much of a gap there is at the moment between the front of the race and the peloton. So in this spirit, I think the real message here with public AI as a new form of multilateralism is that it's power in numbers, that you can pursue self-interest and sovereignty and agency best, particularly for middle powers and non-hegemonic superpowers, when you work together on areas of shared interest and collaborate together to build infrastructure that you can all benefit from, which also helps close the gap on some of these capabilities in AI. And so I think that's a real message. I think where multilateralism is stuck is, and full disclosure, I just read Carney's speech at Davos yesterday, so I'm really just parroting his vibe here. But but it's something that I think a lot of middle power show. I'm Australian. This is a Canadian message coming from Carney, but I think it's something that all of us have been feeling for a long time, that multilateralism has been stuck in this nostalgia for a rules-based international order where people are still clinging on to that. And there's an asymmetry where, often when abuse of that rules-based order comes from non-allied countries, it gets called out. But when your own allies abuse it and have abused it for a long time based on convenience, then you remain quiet. So it's this kind of like calling out the fact that an old era of multilateralism has passed and trying to find the groundings for a new form of collaboration that builds resilience and agency through going together. And I think AI is a great example of this, because by collaborating to build the stack that you need to compete at the frontier of AI, what you actually do is lay the building blocks for a new, potentially, if you think big on this, a new paradigm of value creation. Now, a lot of multilateralism was developed in the second half of last century to support trade and economic interaction around shared norms, which delivered the world a whole lot of value and lifted a lot of people out of poverty. And I think we can think bigger than that kind of just like shared interest exchange of goods and services, to more like, what would it look like to actually establish a new infrastructure for shared problem solving? And that's when my sustainable development kind of issues come back in, when we're managing challenges that go beyond borders, national borders in particular. Anyway, Josh, can you speak some sense into that?
I think there's a thread in there of what Jacob was saying around, building new institutions. And I think we almost, one of our original kind of alternative titles for this piece was "Building is the New Multilateralism." And what we mean by that, and if you read the article, kind of what it highlights is the particular example of Apertus in Switzerland and how we built the public AI inference utility, this like multilateral initiative, including, compute from Australia and Germany and Switzerland and Singapore, to make this kind of open source infrastructure possible. And the argument is that, yes, multilateralism in the past 100 years has been larger about trade, regulation, norms. But nowadays, in a world when there's many entrenched interests, and it's very, very hard to sort of negotiate updates, and it can be much easier to just build new things, to just put stuff, in this case, not even putting stuff into the ground, but just like shifting the way that information flows across jurisdictions in a way that's already natively global. You can just build new systems, software systems, even infrastructure, these kinds of protocols. And it can be exciting, but it's something that countries can just plug into and start doing stuff, right? They can shape this new world of AI and APIs and MTPs and whatever new acronyms, and they can do it. Our argument is that they kind of have to do it together for this to take root.
Yeah, I want to touch upon what you both mentioned, which is that it's about building and it's about problem solving. So using public AI infrastructure for collective problem solving. And you mentioned some initiatives like Apertus and the public AI inference utility. What do these initiatives teach us about what is actually technically possible and what we should be inspired by in terms of how these have come about, how they're governed, and how they're stewarded? Jacob, maybe first to you.
Yeah, the Airbus for AI proposal that's in our article, I think first what it does is helps countries and actors within countries solve problems with AI, and by bridging the capabilities gap with the frontier. So it's like by working together to build a consortium of compute and world-class models, you can develop AI as a public utility grade infrastructure for your country if you're part of this collaborative multilateral group. Step one, and that's, I think, the first value proposition, is working together can help you solve problems at home. Step two is then, if you build this shared infrastructure that's multilateral and international, all of a sudden then you get this second order benefit of having systems and collaborations that can actually help you do other things as well that are traditionally outside the boundaries of national borders. And so, one example that I kind of think about that Australia faces as an energy rich and energy surplus country in Asia, with countries that are energy demand countries, is what would it actually look like to have an infrastructure for tracking the carbon intensity of traded energy goods, which is a super data intensive and ultimately needs to be an AI mediated process over time. But it's also something that needs a lot of trust and infrastructure to actually execute on. And so my thinking is that shared problem solving could be supported by public AI type infrastructure that goes beyond borders, that is built collaboratively, because the basis of those systems could be in place and could be the solutions at the global level could build on top of the infrastructure that could be built through something like an Airbus for AI.
Maybe I'll just add that, there's a elephant in the room, a key part of the subtext that you kind of understand why we pose public AI and why it's connected to multilateralism, which is sovereign AI. Now, in the world, a lot of countries are talking about sovereign AI. NVIDIA is selling billions and billions of dollars of chips on the back of the sovereign AI narrative. But if you think about what sovereign AI is kind of advocating, it kind of naturally lends itself to this idea of countries going it alone. Like, I'm going to build up my AI capacity, my autonomy, my industry. And I think for certain countries, like this clearly does work. But our point that just like over and over again, we see this happening, that a lot of these sovereign AI efforts, and we obviously support them, that they end up falling short because they're just economic factors in play that are just, you just don't have the scale, you don't have the markets, you don't have the VC sort of maturity in your markets to support these kinds of large frontier labs, which are incredibly expensive to run and to operate, much less to get distribution. Just take an example like Mistral, what we think of as like the leading sovereign AI competitor in France, has effectively 1% market adoption in the consumer chatbot market in France, right? It really is a tough problem. And the narrative of public AI and why it matters is in some senses trying to get countries to think outside of the confines of sovereign AI and say, hey, there are things that we all care about. We care about improving the lives of our citizens. We care about this multilateral order of norms, institutions, and laws that have preserved peace and prosperity across the world. And there are things that we can do together based on these common interests, as opposed to do apart. So this idea of public AI and multilateralism, you can see how they kind of come together, especially if you think of what the other alternative actually is.
Yeah. You mentioned that it takes a lot of money. It's incredibly expensive to develop AI, to deploy it. And I'm now thinking of a lot of countries that don't have this financial resourcing to think about ways that AI can support their communities and their people. You mentioned in your article that middle powers have the strongest incentive to pursue public AI. Why middle powers specifically? And what do you think about other countries in the global majority, the private sector, civil society, academia? What is their role and their capacity to be part of public AI?
Maybe I'll take the first part of that question. You can take the latter part in civil society. I think the reality is when we sort of say middle powers, and I'm thinking like, entities like Canada, the UK, Switzerland, Singapore, these are all relatively richer countries, often situated in the global north, who have the capacity and the money effectively to make a large AI industrial policy. And it's going to look very, very different for countries like Rwanda or Mongolia, or I think Brazil, I would include in the first category of middle powers, but other smaller Latin American countries. I think there are different plays though that still look like public AI. So the Airbus proposal, where I'm doing large pre-training runs and trying to compete at the frontier directly with the big labs, that's something that most likely is going to be a middle power play. But the thing about this, we're talking about airplanes and the aerospace industry, right? Not every country is going to have its own Airbus, but every country, or almost every country, has its own airline. And that gives an important measure of autonomy, of control over like how those AI systems, or in this case, how airplanes are deployed in their country, how they represent it. In many ways, like when you fly with a national flag carrier of, I don't know, like Singapore or Brazil, like these are representatives, like often the first encounter that a person has with that country, right? And I think in many ways, the AI systems of the future, or even of today, operate kind of like this. They're representatives of the country. They're symbols of what this country and these communities can do, of their data, of their culture, of their history. And that is something that I think every country in the world can be a part of. You don't necessarily have to train the large models yourself, but you can fine-tune them, you can post-train them, you can customize them, you can deploy them, you can implement custom tooling solutions on top of them to really reflect how you want these systems to be deployed and represent your country and be a kind of interface to your people.
Yeah, and I would just maybe to build on that, I think even since Josh and I published the article last year, public AI has made progress in this domain. So at the time, I think we were hosting in this inference utility, which is basically like what it looks like when you open up ChatGPT or Claude. So it's a software interface to interact with a large language model. And now the capabilities of that mimic what you see in frontier inference utilities, and it's built on open source software. And so the idea is you can host a number of different countries' models. And so we're hosting Apertus from Switzerland, Sea Lion from Singapore. Josh helps me out here from Spain.
There's it's Alia from Spain.
Alia from Spain. And with others in the mix. But the idea here is that that's all been, obviously the underlying compute and models have been provided by different actors across the globe. But the idea here is that the Airbus proposes that you could centralize resources to build frontier capabilities. I think part of the Airbus is actually you would pull together a global lab, like a CERN for the physics research, but for AI kind of thing, and build models that are as good as GPT-5, but then make those available to countries and actors to fine tune or specify for their needs. And so that's like the Airbus airline kind of setup. And so in that context, then that gets me to your question about poorer countries who don't have the resources. But the idea, if it's a collaboratively governed, almost like multilateral style governance of these public utility systems, then the proposal is that public AI would be a better option, a more attractive option for the poorest countries who don't have this infrastructure, because it gives them agency and voice in how these systems are governed. Because basically it becomes anyone who wants to access these systems would become a stakeholder in the governance of the system. And it's a product that would be delivered at a cost lower than private companies, because the interest here is delivering a public utility. And so richer countries and all participating stakeholders, public actors, would help subsidize the costs, and it's not a profit-making enterprise. So that's kind of the offer, I guess, over time, if this really built momentum. And in the work that public AI has done already through this inference utility, you can see this already happening, and a kind of minimum viable demonstration of a possibility here, which is building as a new form of multilateralism by committing resources to this stack of systems. You get a seat at the table, basically, is the proposal.
And here we're not talking just about countries, right? We're talking about civil society,
right.
Academia having a stake and being able to govern and hold accountability to these systems.
And maybe and great question. That's where I think one thing we haven't talked a lot about now is part of the data and the way in which actors now are increasingly less comfortable with kind of giving away their information and interaction with these models. Like in a social media era of technology, I think people were like pretty blind to the costs of, or the bargain associated with using these platforms for free, but the hidden externality was that you're kind of like the data was part of the transaction. I think increasingly public actors, civil society actors, actually even individuals, consumers, are realizing that they would prefer a more vegan, organic, and kind of a version of this technology that allows the user to maintain and control the information they put into them. And because there's a lot of value that can be self-generated through those interactions. And I do think it's possible now that as public AI is demonstrating that you can strike a balance here between user equity in these systems and the kind of data that it's extracted for value and sustainability of the business of these models. But Josh, maybe again you can speak more sense into that angle.
Natalie, you mentioned you were in Geneva, right?
Yes.
So actually, in not too long, we're going to be announcing the formation of a Swiss cooperative to govern the Swiss deployment of public AI. So it's the Swiss Public Inference Utility. I usually just advertise it as Migros for AI. I imagine you go to Migros every now and then.
Yeah, it's just downstairs.
That's hilarious. Yeah, so the idea is, and you can see these examples popping up for ISPs where, like, instead of paying $240 a year to OpenAI, what if you just you paid $100 for public AI and you actually own part of the company, right? Just like how a traditional co-op works. It's all about lowering prices, delivering value, just like no nonsense kind of stuff. And that is the kind of institution building that we're talking about. I think that we can sort of exemplify when we talk about public AI and start offering these services. And yes, it's a co-op, so it's like kind of like an alternative. It's not the government per se, but it's made possible because of all these open source investments of this infrastructure that's been put in place to make these things possible, right? So there's all sorts of new avenues that civil society and other institutions can tap into when there is appropriate intervention and investment. Otherwise, the most likely thing is you just use OpenAI or you use DeepSeek or whatever it is that happens to be available.
Yeah. I also want to ask you about what you think about the governance debates and the governance initiatives happening today at the multilateral level on AI. We saw last year that the General Assembly adopted and established two new initiatives, the Scientific Panel on AI and also the Global Dialogue on AI. What do you think about these initiatives? Do you think that they can be a part of this new idea of public AI and be a part of how we deploy it? Joshua, you have written, I've seen quite extensively about why we don't need another scientific body or IPCC-like body to govern AI. Maybe first to you.
So I guess I should be clear. I was part of some of there were like, I don't know, a year or 2 years ago, there was 2 or 3 calls for an IPCC-like body for AI. I was actually part of one of those calls. And then I started talking to people and just thinking about it. And it's like, is this actually useful? Because what is IPCC? It's basically a giant peer review process involving a bunch of scientists around the world trying to understand what is the state of the art or what is the state of a given sort of system. So IPCC is for climate, right? And I just make the point in the argument in the blog post that, yeah, the climate is something that's like very objective. It's shared by all of us. You can read it off of hundreds of thousands of measurements from all sorts of places, and it makes sense for an IPCC thing to exist. Whereas frontier AI is sitting inside right now, like a very few labs that are all closed, who will basically stop publishing their capabilities research like at least 2 or 3 years ago. And if you think about it that way, like how Dengio has no idea what the frontier of AI is because he's not sitting inside these labs. He's like from the outside, oh, yeah, obviously like, people in AI are doing research here, but they don't have access to what is going on within the places who are actually generating these frontier models. If you don't have that, like what is the use of an IPCC, right? Do you have access into what's going on in the private into DeepSeek? It's like, it's pretty much impossible for anybody, even in China, to talk to that team, right? Given that, I think the reality is having dialogues about these things and having a peer review process for it seems it's not going to address like the key kind of regulatory and safety questions, right? Even though I think it still can be helpful for other processes, for other reasons, which is why I think it's so important to have your own horse in the game. You are yourself building capabilities. You are doing research. You are training these models. That is the only way you can truly understand what is at the frontier if you are at the frontier yourself. I think this public AI idea, this Airbus idea is a way of doing that in a multilateral way, in this kind of third wave frontier lab, rather than something that's like sitting outside and sort of from the outside looking in, like, oh, what is going through in this very opaque crystal ball?
Jacob.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think there's a bit of an awkward vibe where it feels like a lot of countries, a lot of actors outside the US and China are kind of awkwardly sitting outside the party, hearing the kind of dull bass thud of the music and not really in there knowing what's happening. And so it feels a bit awkward at this stage. However, I do think the safety and regulation dimensions of AI globally are super important to get right. But I'm not in that camp or not contributing to that at the moment because I almost feel candidly that these discussions have taken up a lot of energy or attracted a lot of energy at the expense of the other part of global collaboration, which is delivering on shared interests and public goods. And I think this is, again, something that's a big issue in the digital transformation debates as well, not just AI, but, there's so much that part of the magic of digital is that its ability to be reused, it's non-rival, and a data set over here, you can use it for a near zero cost. And the more you get people using shared infrastructure, the more the network effects grow. And so there's just this kind of, for me at the global level, that needs to be more conversations about shared prosperity and equity in digital and AI systems. And again, it's something we're trying to really push in the digital public infrastructure world, which is that, it's crazy that countries, particularly developing countries globally, are spending huge amounts of money rebuilding foundational digital infrastructure for their countries and economies, like digital IDs, payment systems, from scratch, when great open source, already established infrastructures exist and could be reused. Parts of the code base and learnings and integration of these systems could just be ported and reused at a fraction of the cost. But the problem is a lot of the multilateral international financial institutions like the World Bank and others aren't set up to incentivize that kind of reuse of infrastructure. And so the question then becomes, like, how do we think about a different paradigm of shared infrastructure, reusing infrastructure in a digital and AI world? And I think that's the conversation I'd love to be part of at a global level, because I think just the safety conversation, in the way, given how concentrated these systems are in private interests, is a little bit, I'm almost becoming a bit conspiratorial or skeptical about why so many people worry about safety, and whose interests everyone worried about safety serves. Because when you actually look closely at the safety issues globally, the type of work that needs to happen is exactly the same work that we're proposing through Airbus. It's multilateral, coordinated, collaborative efforts to regulate the technology. But to Josh's point, in order to do that, you've got to be building it. So why don't we just start building it together, and then we can and then we can join the safety with the infrastructure conversation.
There's a lot more we could talk about, but I want to maybe ask you both a final question related to what you said, Jacob, which is, let's just start building. You've mentioned a lot of public AI initiatives are popping up, but if we are to start building now and to build momentum, what are the main steps? What are the things we can do now? Josh.
I think one very, very easy thing is just public AI already exists. You can just use it. So we've actually already are in conversations with UNICEF, with the IOO, different parts of the UN, Red Cross, to get them to use public AI, because I think a lot of these kind of values aligned multilateral institutions, they can see, like, yeah, this is the kind of AI. If they're going to use AI, and for better or worse, a lot of them are beginning or sort of already using it, incorporating it into their systems. You can just call the API. You can use the interface. We can set up a sort of like a little suite for you. It just works. I think on top of that, there are other things we can do to just say, hey, are there policies? Are there either writings we can publish, we can sort of co-write, collaborate on, different memos? I think one of the big things here is just movement building and narrative building. Because right now, the narrative of private AI is so strong. People just think, like, they think AI, they think OpenAI, or they think maybe Anthropic or DeepSeek, right? They don't even realize there's an alternative out there that actually aligns with their values, what they think the world should look like. And I think that is what we really want to sort of try to get out there, just get the message that there is an alternative. It is possible. People are already building it, and you can be part of building it too.
Jacob, you mentioned the bio, the organic, the vegan. How do we make it the mainstream?
Well, I think a shift in thinking from the procurers of these systems, the actors who are making decisions about what turns up in countries and organizations, I think making the shift from this is not just another software product, it's actually infrastructure that will define the way you operate in the next era. And so if you think of AI as infrastructure, then what kind of infrastructure do you want to build on? Do you want to build on and get locked into a private stack that you have no ability to shape or negotiate price and so on? Or do you want to build an infrastructure that you can control and shape to deliver value and deliver on your interests? And I think that's constant for countries, organizations, actors everywhere.
We also ask every guest to share one open access resource you recommend for our listeners. Josh, what would be yours?
I think publicai.co. Just try out public AI. Go into the chat, talk to it, ask it for its secrets, ask what's going on in Switzerland or in Spain or Singapore. I think that's what I was referring to.
And Jacob?
Yeah, that would be the same thing. So that would be my answer. So Josh, do you have a second one that you would recommend? That's just like
I think if you're interested in more of the writing and that's kind of the movement stuff behind it, go to publicai.network, and that will have a lot of papers from the econ side, from Mozilla, from Bertelsmann, from Vanderbilt, from the Canadian government, that you can explore different public AI strategies across the world.
Amazing. Thank you. Jacob, Taylor, Joshua Tan, thank you so much for joining us. We'll make sure that the links to your article and those links you mentioned are in the show notes.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thanks so much, Natalie.
Thank you. Take care.
Cheers.